We cannot look to technology in the classroom as the solution to the problems we would like to fix.
Hello, and welcome to the Arts of Language podcast with Andrew Pudewa, founder of the Institute for Excellence in Writing, or as many like to say, IEW. My name is Julie Walker, and I'm honored to serve Andrew and IEW as the Chief Marketing Officer. Our goal is to equip teachers and teaching parents with methods and materials which will aid them in training their students to become confident and competent communicators and thinkers. So, Andrew, I am holding in my hands the book that you wrote, and it took you decades to write this book. It's called, However Imperfectly, Lessons Learned from 30 Years of Teaching and Other Articles. So this is just a compilation of all the articles that you were forced to write over the years.
And it goes way back.
It does. It goes, I think,
back to 99, I think, or even before.
Yeah, the very first article that you wrote was on the 6 traits writing assessment, and it was in 1998. And of course, we now know that 6 trait writing assessment model is now 6+1.
Right.
Is it 6+2 yet?
No, it's still 6+1.
Right.
Yeah, I had cause to revisit the 6 trait question just recently.
Oh, interesting.
We can do a podcast on that sometime. But why are you holding this book that finally I wrote after years and years of people saying, did you write a book?
Yes. Well, it was funny because when we first estimated how many pages this book would be, we just did a graphic representation of what we thought the book would look like. And it's actually twice as thick as what we...
I wasn't pleased. Could have had 2 books out of 1 if we just did volume 1 and 2.
True. It is true. So, but these are other articles that you've written over the years. And the topic that I would like to have a conversation with you about is actually maybe loosely based on one of these articles. And this was one that you wrote in 2017 called Low-Tech Teaching with High-End Results. Now, you wrote this article, 3-4 years ago. Mm-hmm. So technology, of course, has not grown at all in the last 4 years. No, it's actually
depends on where you look. More
prevalent. And, you know, we're having a new generation of teachers and educators who have so many tools available to them today that they didn't have 4 years ago, let alone, 24 years ago when you and I were still teaching. So,
well, I think the seed of that article was planted in my mind years before when I read the book, The Flickering Mind, The False Promise of Technology in the Classroom by Oppenheimer, I believe. Mm-hmm. And that book was just fascinating because, he's a Wall Street Journal reporter. He traveled the country. He spent a year collecting up information and visiting various schools. And essentially, he found, this was over 10 years ago. So, you could say it's old. Mm-hmm. But you could also say, has anything really changed? Mm-hmm. But what he found was almost an direct inverse correlation between technology in the classroom, meaning computers, mostly smartboards, tablets, whatever, and basic skills, meaning reading, writing, and arithmetic. Mm-hmm. In the low-tech or zero-tech schools, he found the highest levels of basic skills. Now, it's hard. You have to be careful you're not comparing apples and oranges proverbially here, because when you look at a low-tech school like a Waldorf, even if it's a charter school, a Waldorf charter school, it is a public school, but the level of parental involvement is going to be much, much, much higher. But it was fascinating. The best example he had was a location that was in the essentially the same part of the city. It was two charter schools that had been established at approximately the same time. And one was a high-tech STEM charter school. Mm-hmm. The other was a Waldorf zero-tech charter mm-hmm. school. Mm-hmm. And he said that, it's unquestionable. The computers do not help children learn to read or write or do arithmetic, especially, and that's more and more true at the younger grades. Obviously, when you get into higher level function, at a high school level, then, the assistance of technology for writing and proofreading and understanding grammar and storing and organizing information, mm-hmm. As well as the need for calculators and higher math. Mm-hmm. But I think he made a very compelling argument. I think it's still very valid today that we cannot look to technology in the classroom as the solution to the problems we would like to fix with basic skills and test scores and all of that.
Right. Well, and the topic of this podcast is, when is technology appropriate? When does it contribute to their learning in a positive way? Because you and I have had many conversations about technology over the years in these podcasts, most notably when we had a 3 or 4 part conversation on paper and pen, what the research says. And you spend quite a bit of time there talking about exactly what you just mentioned right now.
Right.
And we've also talked about the need for the younger kids just to have a screen-free environment, especially in their formative years. Mm-hmm. But when is it appropriate? When is it helpful?
Well, I guess you have to define technology. I mean, I've told the story of the Egyptian king and the god Thoth, or Thoth, or Thuth, however you pronounce it.
So tell that story.
And, he basically said to the king, I am the maker of all good things, and I give you the gift of writing. And the king said, well, that's well and good, but it will gradually erode or weaken the faculty of memory. So when we think about technology, we tend to think of what's the newest kind of app or device or, site that we can use to accomplish what we want. But there's always been technology. Mm-hmm. So writing replaced memory. Pencils replaced quills. Mm-hmm. Well, we'll say pens replaced styluses, and pencils and modern pens replaced quills, mm-hmm. and then typewriters didn't necessarily replace pens, but certainly opened up a whole new avenue of technology. And then with word processing that came to exist, around the 80s and 90s, that was continued. And now, of course, the sky's the limit. You can't even say what the current technology is because it'll be surpassed in a short time, and then your podcast is outdated.
Exactly right. Yep. So I think of these, of course, like you, I have young grandchildren, and I think of the culture that they're growing up in, and there's so many apps now that are geared toward them to assist with learning their letters and sounds and numbers and counting, and it's just a fun little game. Is that a negative thing? Or, this is not necessarily replacing the pen and paper, but it's just like an enhancement.
Well, I think that's the key. Mm-hmm. If we look at the educational apps created for children, of which almost all, if not all, are game-like, mm-hmm. and we say, what is the role of that? I think it would be dangerous to say, we're going to use that to teach basic skills. Mm-hmm. We're going to expect the app to teach the kid to read and teach her to do, learn her math facts and somehow get them writing. Now, there are apps, I believe, that would like to sell you on the idea that they can do that. I haven't seen that, and I know there's a lot of parents and children and teachers who've experienced being so distracted with the technology itself, they lose the time that it would take to just do basic direct instruction the way people did 50, 100, 150, 200, 2,000 years ago.
Exactly, yes.
Now, we get into this world of writing, and that's where we live most of the time. And I don't think we should focus on debating about teaching reading at this moment. But we're more about writing, and that's where the bigger question comes. Is my child fill in the blank, right? So can I let him fill in the blank? So the most typical fill in the blanks would be, my child is extremely dysgraphic, so can I let him dictate the story to me and I write it down for him? The answer is yes, absolutely. Why wouldn't you?
Right.
And we've talked about, the value and the integration of the speaking and writing as a function. So then you would move one step and say, well, my child is very, very dysgraphic. He can't put anything on paper. He's now a teenager. Can I let him dictate to the computer? And we've got from our incredible voice recognition on our iPhones to Siri, it's very, very reasonable, especially if you activate the special functions in your system to help. There's a term for that, those apps that help people who have generally motor or sensory handicaps. And you can activate those, and then it's even more because there are people who physically cannot possibly even type keys.
Right, exactly.
So they talk. So it's interesting. We moved from very much a print culture to a much more verbal culture with television and telephones and everything. And then we moved really back into a print culture with the explosion of blogs and websites and news sites and emails and junk emails, and we're just constantly flooded with text. And so a lot of people are very busy creating content to go with all of that text that's getting, spewed out ubiquitously everywhere. But in a way, we may move back to a verbal where people say, I don't want to read it. Just computer, tell me what it says. Read the text to me. I don't want to write. I don't want to type. I'll just talk, and that'll go to someone else. And that person might then decode the text you talked into so they can listen to it rather than have to read it. I don't even know. There may be professors out there who just have the computer read the papers, or I doubt it, but you never know. So it's funny, this fluid nature between speaking and writing is even more, the differential between the two is less today than ever before.
Sure.
So, when you look at adaptive technology, you would say, yeah, absolutely. If a child has a case of dyslexia or dysgraphia that make it overwhelmingly burdensome for him to work on decoding and encoding, why wouldn't you help that? The same way you would assist a child who was a quadriplegic or, had no ability to use their mouth or their hands. But there are people who've written whole books, even though they can't type or talk.
Right.
So, we have to, I think, look at it very flexibly. There is another side to it, though.
Okay. I've been waiting to hear where this was going to go.
Well, the other side is reflecting on the king of Egypt and what he said to the god Thoth, whatever. He said, this is good, but we will lose our memory. We won't have real learning. We'll just have the appearance of learning. I'm paraphrasing here because I don't remember the exact quote. This story, by the way, can be found in Plato in one of the dialogues.
Well, I absolutely do not know what it is, but I will let our listeners know. There will be a link in the show notes to this story.
It's in one of the dialogues. And so that king in that fable, notice that. We need to stand on the same point and notice if we move into utilizing this level of technology, we may lose something distinctly human, something actually useful, something that allows us greater opportunity, particularly intellectually. So we want to be sure and balance. I'll give you an example. that I think everyone has noticed in the last several decades, and that is it is increasingly difficult for children, whether they are in public schools, private schools, hybrid schools, or homeschool, it is increasingly difficult for them to learn basic math facts. It is increasingly difficult for them to do mental math of any sort. I've noticed this because I travel around and do some workshops, and there's one little thing I do for high schoolers, which is, do this division problem here, right? 1,000 divided by 140. It's pretty much always the same problem. And you get 1 out of 20 kids who can even think about how to do that problem mentally. Mm-hmm. The rest are like, well, I need a calculator. Where's my phone? I couldn't. Mm-hmm. So, sad, because I think if you looked 100 years ago, probably any sixth grader could have given a pretty good approximation on that, because that was just normal. So as we equip children with technology like calculators and allow that to be used at a younger age or increasingly younger ages, then what we find is that children don't look at numbers and see relationships.
Sure.
They don't look at 12 and immediately kind of think 9 plus 3, 10 plus 2, 8 plus 4. They don't look at 42 and immediately think 6 and 7, 6 times 7. They don't think mathematically because they haven't had the mental practice. Just like learning a language. You have to gain fluency, which is speed and confidence and competence, in math as well, in English composition as well. So, how do we walk that line and say, okay, let's just say no to this technology until a certain point.
Right.
If we look at the world of writing, are there some people who would say, yes, it would be very, very good for all children to leave, say, elementary school with an ability to write on paper quickly, fairly accurately, confidently, naturally. And yet, if we bring, tablets and keyboards all the way down into grade 1 and 2, are we going to also be able, in the busy schedule of curriculum and everything you have to do, to gain those basic skills? I think in the home, what you generally see is, kids can do work on paper, and then they can have recreation, if you will.
Screen time,
learning to use the technology. We don't need necessarily to make using the technology a part of curriculum so that it displaces the time used for developing basic skills. Because I think almost every parent would say, yeah, I would like my child to have the ability to write on paper 10 years from now.
Right.
So if that's what you want, okay, you may have to plan for it, because the technology will just keep moving and, in a way, being more and more invasive. But getting back to Oppenheimer's book, his closing statement, I thought, was really the culmination of the logic and the reason, along with the common sense and experience. And that is, he said, technology amplifies whatever you have. So if you have an organized, efficient, focused, productive individual, and you equip them with the best technology available, they will actually become more productive, more organized, more efficient, because we know, one person, especially when you get into the world of correspondence or bookkeeping, one person can do the work that 20 people once had to do.
Sure.
In a business. But on the flip side, if you give a disorganized, unfocused, inefficient person more technology, it tends to make them more disorganized, more distracted, more inefficient. And then he leaves the reader with the question, what's your average 10-year-old like?
Yeah, exactly.
Are they naturally organized, efficient, productive, focused? Or are they naturally different and you have to work to build those qualities?
Yeah, because being organized is a skill that is teachable.
Absolutely. Well, look at all of the time management and life planning and methods people have come up with checklists, and
Right.
all that's well and good, and I think very valuable and important to teach kids those basic study skills, if you will. But if you don't teach it, I think the problem, and what we all would like, is for something to do that for me, right? I just want to buy something that will teach my kid that, when maybe what you really need to do is that, personal mentoring, and then see how you can use the technology, model that technology, and say, this is how we can use spreadsheets. This is how we can use, a spell checker and a grammar checker. That's how we can. But if you just leave the kid to discover it all, he may get very distracted, flounder about a bit.
Yes. I think of our writing classes, our structure and style for students. I know I always circle back to that, but every class we spend a few minutes at the end of class where the kids organize their binders. So we're trying to teach them right at the beginning, be organized, because you might need to refer to this paper again and you need to know where to find it. And I would love to think that perhaps a student will transfer that into other areas of life, not just their writing class.
Sure. Well, it's everything. It's
Sure.
spatial organization. I bet people who have a fairly neat space in terms of, say, their desk or workplace also have a fairly organized desktop on their computer. And I'll bet the opposite may be true, too, in many cases, not all. So how do you teach organization? Because technology will amplify whatever you teach.
Right, right.
If you teach kids how to research on paper, right, like our Unit 6, and we've seen this, then you make the shift and say, okay, here's how you can do that same thing by accessing information on the internet, but you've built a pathway. You just throw kids and say, go Google stuff, and what level of research happens here?
Right. They're probably going to find articles that are other articles that are based on other articles that, it's all the same article on that particular topic that you can find 100 places.
And a lot of kids might not have even basic sense of how to judge validity or veracity. And that's one of the things, that I have taught in various classes.
Well, and just going back to, my example and your example of Unit 6, you ask the students, what's the advantage of having multiple sources? That's what our Unit 6 is. It's the research project where they're using multiple sources. And oftentimes the kids will say, it demonstrates, may not say these words, but it does demonstrate veracity.
Right.
But if they happen to find that same article 20 different places, that doesn't necessarily mean veracity. It means someone's copying and pasting.
Yeah, and that happens a lot. And I've even got into that thinking, whoa, another article that supports
Right.
And that's the same
Right.
source. But we look at the fact that technology is increasing more rapidly than really we can imagine.
Right.
I don't think anyone our age 20 years ago could have imagined the way things are now. And we have become accustomed to taking them all for granted, but we still have the memory of doing without.
That is very true, Andrew. As we were having this conversation, I was remembering my 9th grade physical science class. And guess what we did at the beginning of every class? We had a slide rule quiz.
A slide rule?
A slide rule quiz where our instructor wanted us to do basic calculations using our slide rule. That year, which I believe was, 1974, at the end of that year, he stopped doing them because calculators were becoming so popular. That people, he gave us a choice, slide rule or calculator. Well, duh.
Yeah.
I'm going to use a calculator because I can't figure out the slide rule. No, anyway.
Well, the thing about the slide rule is, and I don't use it well, but my father was an engineer in the 50s and 60s, so that they sent people to space with slide rules. But, you still have to think mathematically. You can't just mindlessly punch in numbers and look at an answer and assume that it's right.
Exactly.
And that is what we find a lot of times is kids will put down answers that don't even make sense because they didn't have a mathematical concept that would give them an expectation by which to judge, did they push the buttons correctly? Right?
Exactly. Yep.
So, yeah, so we don't know, what will the next 10 years hold? What will the next 20 hold? I mean, you kind of always think, gosh, how can anything go further than it is?
Right.
But then people thought that 100 years ago.
Or even 5 years ago when you wrote your article, we didn't believe that it was, well, I'm sure you did.
Who knows? So it's definitely an area to navigate. But I do highly recommend Oplinger's book. And there's another book I'll mention. I just finished reading it. I think I mentioned it to you. It's by Daniel Willingham. It's called, I think, When Can You Trust the Experts? And I thought, this is such an important book because he gives you very concrete advice as to how to look at research and not just assume that everything you see is absolute or even correct, because so many things have either been non-replicated or disproven, and yet they're still used and quoted. And he had lots of fascinating examples. And his book is particularly focusing on research pertaining to education and education policy.
Right.
Because what we often see is people will get some idea, whether it's look-say method of teaching reading, or whether it's learning styles, or whether it's technology related, and they'll say, let's make this big change. And there's no research at all as to whether this change would be good. And that seems to be something we've seen in education, is these big changes without any strong support for the idea that this is a good change.
Right.
And in some cases, we've had bad changes because we've seen basic skills like reading decline and then rise and decline. So somebody's changing something to make the declines.
Right. And it's just gratifying to know that what we are doing here at the Institute for Excellence in Writing, even though our company itself is 25 years old, a little bit more now, it's based on a methodology that goes way back with Dr. Webster in Canada, and he actually put together the pieces based on other type of information and methodology that goes all the way back to the Progymnasmata.
Ancient times.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
So here we are. So pen and paper, we don't have too many apps for students anyway. We have a few for the parents, the checklist generator.
Well, we have the Word Right Now in app form.
Right. That's a great reference.
That's a great tool. Mm-hmm. That is an example of really useful technology.
Right.
It's limited in scope. It's not a game.
Mm-hmm.
It's a reference, and you can find stuff quickly.
Right.
You could also just buy the book.
Or you could buy the book, and we have it both. So, well, thank you.
I'm just curious. Do you still own a set of encyclopedias?
I do not. Do you?
Somewhere.
Yes, in one of your
They're
boxes.
in a box. I've been moving around and reorganizing books. But, I look back very fondly on the paper encyclopedia. I spent countless hours as a child surfing, if you will.
Yes.
The encyclopedia. And it worked in a much broader way than internet surfing because, and I think Martin Cawthorne said it well, he wrote an article called In Praise of Accidental Knowledge. You stumble into something, you wouldn't have ever been looking for it, and you're like, well, that's just fascinating, and it happened to be right next to the thing I actually was looking for.
Right.
So I would encourage, parents, if you can get your hands on an old set, a pre-electronic paper set of encyclopedias, and just have it in the house while your kids are growing up. They may or may not use it, but you can use it. You can show them how to use it.
Yep.
And then you can, when the lights go out, there's something to read.
There you go.
Of course, if the lights are out.
Thank you, Andrew. This has been very helpful.
Thank you, Julie.
Thanks so much for joining us. If you enjoyed this episode and want to hear more, you can subscribe to this podcast in iTunes, Google Play, or Stitcher, or just visit us each week at iew.com/podcast. Until then, on behalf of Andrew Pudewa and the team at IEW, I thank you for allowing us to partner with you on your journey toward better listening, speaking, reading, writing, and thinking.